Good afternoon. The League of Women Voters of Sacramento County and Metro Cable Channel 14 are pleased to bring you this forum, featuring candidates running for the June 8th primary election and ballot propositions 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17. My name is Lola Acosta, and I am a member of the League of Women Voters of Sacramento County, and I will be serving as the host for the propositions portion of our program. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization of women and men that encourages citizens to be informed and to participate in government at all levels. The League does not support or oppose any candidate or political party. Rather, the League provides information and moderates candidate forums, such as this, to help voters learn about candidates and make informed choices at the polls. We will now be moving to the pros and cons presentation of our program. The pros and cons address ballot measures in a nonpartisan educational manner. I wish to introduce to you Eileen Heiser, who will present propositions 13 through 17. Eileen.
Good afternoon. I will be providing a brief overview of the proposals, the fiscal impact, and the supporters' expenditures. And in the interest of time, I will not be discussing the pro and con arguments against and for these propositions. Information was drawn on from the official voter information guide published by the Secretary of State, and it can be located at www.voterguide.sos.ca.gov, and it is available in 7 languages. The other guide is the Easy Voter Guide from the League of Women Voters of California, and this can be located at www.easyvoter.org, and it's available in 5 languages. Proposition 13 is a legislative constitutional amendment, and it puts limits on property tax assessment in regard to seismic retrofitting of existing buildings. It provides that construction to seismically retrofit existing buildings will not trigger reassessment of property tax value regardless of the type of building. It sets a statewide standard for the types of seismic retrofit improvements exempt from reassessment. It limits the exemption from reassessment to specific components of construction or reconstruction that qualify as seismic retrofit improvements, as defined by the legislature. The fiscal impact is possibly minor reduction due to local property tax revenues related to the assessment of earthquake upgrades. And currently, there are several specific exclusions in the state constitution from the new construction rule. Among them are 2 separate provisions regarding earthquake safety modifications on existing buildings. The first one excludes earthquake safety upgrades on unreinforced masonry buildings. Such upgrades are excluded from reassessments for a period of 15 years. The second excludes from reassessment other earthquake safety modifications to any type of building and has no time limit. Both exclusions apply only until the property is sold. Now, the Constitutional Amendment 13 deletes both of the existing exclusions and replaces them with a single exclusion for all earthquake safety upgrades. The exclusion would not be time limited and would last until the property is sold. This amendment has the practical effect of removing the 15-year limit to the exclusion for safety upgrades on unreinforced masonry buildings. There was no written opposition to this amendment. The 14th the 14th proposition is a legislative constitutional amendment. It increases the right to participate in primary elections. It encourages the increased participation in elections for congressional, legislative, and statewide offices by changing the procedure by which candidates are selected in primary elections. It gives voters increased options in the primary by allowing all voters to choose any candidate regardless of the candidate's or the voter's political party preference. It provides that candidates may choose not to have a political party preference indicated on the primary ballot. It provides that only the two candidates receiving the greatest number of votes in the primary will appear on the general election ballot regardless of party preference. It does not change primary elections for president, party committee officials or offices, and nonpartisan offices. The fiscal impact, there's no significant net change in the state and local government costs to administer the elections. This measure amends the state constitution and changes the election process for most state and federal offices. Its provisions and related legislation would take effect for elections after January 1st, 2011. It creates what's called a top-2, TWO, top two primary election by creating a single ballot for primary elections for congressional and state elective offices. All candidates would be listed, including independent candidates who now would appear on the primary ballot. Each voter would cast his or her vote using this single primary ballot. A voter registered with the Republican Party, for example, would be able to vote in the primary election for a candidate registered as a Democrat, a candidate registered as a Republican, or any other candidate. The two candidates with the highest number of votes in the primary election, regardless of their party preference, would advance to compete in the general election. In fact, the two candidates in the general election could have the same party preference. And the offices that are included, would be included in this primary, new type of primary, are the governor, lieutenant governor, secretary of state, treasurer, controller, insurance commissioner, attorney general, state senators, state assembly members, state board of equalization members, and United States senators and members of the House of Representatives. This measure does not affect presidential elections and political party leadership positions. Under this measure, there would still be partisan primary elections for presidential candidates and political party offices, including party central committees, party officials, and presidential delegates. For yes on 14, Californians for an open primary with major funding from Governor Schwarzenegger's California Dream Team so far has spent $967,000, or slightly more than that. And Swanson's ballot measure committee to oppose Proposition 14 has spent $102. Proposition 15 is also a legislative initiative amendment. It's called the California Fair Elections Act. This act repeals the ban on public funding of political campaigns. It creates a voluntary system for candidates for Secretary of State to qualify for a public campaign grant if they agree to limitations on spending and private contributions. Candidates would have to qualify before receiving the grant. Candidates who demonstrate sufficient public support would receive the same amount. Participating candidates would be prohibited from raising or spending money beyond the grant. There would be strict enforcement and accountability with published reports open to the public. Funding would come from voluntary contributions and a biannual fee on lobbyists, lobbying firms, and lobbyist employers. The fiscal impact, there would be increased revenues, mostly from the charges on the lobbyists and the lobbying firms and the lobbyist employers, totaling over $6 million every 4 years. These funds would be spent on the public financing for campaigns of the Secretary of State candidates for the years of 2014 and 2018 elections. And it's very important to understand that this is a pilot amendment initiative. And it will be looked at for that 8 years to determine how this particular initiative would work. And it is only for the Office of Secretary of State. That's where the pilot is being taken place. So it's important to remember it's a pilot study. The state law bans the use of public funds for political candidates' campaigns. The law extends to all elected offices at the state level and most local level elected offices. Campaign finance laws are administered by the Fair Political Practices Commission and the Secretary of State. Lobbyists also registration is administered by the Secretary of State. And at this current time, every 2 years, lobbyists, lobbying firms, and the lobbyist employers must register with the Secretary of State. And there is currently a $25 fee related to each lobbyist to cover the administrative expenses. And this, with this new amendment, if it passes, that fee would be $700 every 2 years. This proposal lifts the ban on the public spending. It establishes a public funding fund for the Secretary of State campaign. And the Secretary of State, the state's chief elections officer, is elected on the statewide ballot every 4 years. A candidate for Secretary of State meeting certain requirements could receive the state funds to pay for the costs of a political campaign. The amount of funds that a candidate would receive would go up if an opponent spent more private funds. This measure expires on January 1st, 2019, meaning it would apply to the Secretary of State campaigns for the 2014 and 2018 elections. To receive public funding, a candidate could not accept private campaign funding with 4 main exceptions. The candidate must collect the $5 qualifying contribution. These qualifying contributions would be deposited into the fund supporting the public financing program. And there is a chart in this particular publication that describes how that will work. Second, beginning 18 months prior to a primary election, candidates could collect and spend startup contributions or seed money. These funds could be spent, for example, to pay costs for collecting the qualifying contributions. The measure restricts seed money contributions to $100 for each registered voter, and total contributions would be limited to $75,000 per campaign. Third, candidates could accept a certain amount of contributions from political parties, 5% of the base level of public funds in each of the primary elections and the general election. That is up to $50,000 for the primary election and $65,000 for the general election campaign. In the event that the program did not have enough funds to give to eligible candidates, candidates could raise from private donors the difference between what they are entitled to receive from the state and what they could actually receive. The public funds could only be used for direct campaign expenses. The measure contains various restrictions to prevent funds from being used for other purposes. And if the commission determines that there is not enough money in the program to fund all eligible candidates, the commission would reduce the grants proportionately to all eligible candidates. In the primary election pamphlet, there is a table that describes the amount of money that is base level for primary elections and for general elections. And it has all the various funding for if you're a minor candidate or a major candidate. There's a possibility of a conflict between this Proposition 15 and the one just previously discussed, Proposition 14. If Proposition 14 is approved, it would change the primary and general election system for state offices, including the Secretary of State. Proposition 14 makes changes that could conflict with the proposed statutory provisions of the public campaign funding system under this measure 15. For example, a potential conflict in this measure's linking of certain funding decisions to participation in a partisan primary election, which would no longer exist if Proposition 14 were to pass, because that gets rid of the partisanship. So if both measures pass, conflicting provisions of these two measures would have to be reconciled through additional legislation, judicial action, or future ballot measures. The yes on Proposition 15, Californians for Fair Elections, a coalition of nurses and government reform advocates, have expended $180,000 so far. And Stop Proposition 15.com, a coalition of taxpayers, governmental advocates, and small businesses have expended $2,567. Proposition 16 is an initiative constitutional amendment. It imposes new 2/3 voter approval requirement for local public electricity providers. It is also known as Taxpayers' Right to Vote Act. It requires local governments to obtain the approval of 2/3 of the voters before providing electricity service to new customers or expanding such service to new territories using public funds or bonds. It requires the same 2/3 vote to provide electricity service through a community choice program using public funds or bonds. It requires the vote to be in the jurisdiction of the local government and any new territory to be served. It provides exceptions to the voting requirements for a limited number of identified projects. So there are some exceptions. The fiscal impact is unknown, but unlikely to be significant in the short run. Publicly owned electric utilities are public entities that provide electricity service to residents and businesses in their local area. These electric utilities are governed by locally elected boards, which set their own terms of service, including the rates charged to their customers. Electricity service is currently provided by local governments through several different governmental structures authorized under state law, and these include utility departments of cities such as the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, municipal utility districts such as the Sacramento Municipal Utility District and East Bay MUD, and public utilities such as the Truckee-Donner Public Utility District and irrigation districts. This measure places new voter approval requirements on local governments before they can use public funds, which are defined broadly in this particular measure to include tax revenues, various forms of debt, and ratepayer funds to start up electricity service, expand electricity service into a new territory, or implement a community choice aggregation, a CCA. First, before an authorized local government entity can start up electricity service, it must receive approval by 2/3 of the voters in the area proposed to be served. Second, before an existing publicly owned utility can expand its electric service delivery service into a new territory, it must receive approval by 2/3 of the voters in the area currently served by the utility and 2/3 of the voters in the area for the proposed service. Third, the measure requires a 2/3 vote approval for a local company to implement the CCA. There are 3 exemptions to local governments from these voter approval requirements. They are, if the use of public funds has been previously approved by the voters both within the existing local jurisdiction and the territory proposed for expansion, then there will be an exception. If the public funds would be used solely to purchase, provide, or supply specified types of electricity from renewable sources such as wind or solar power, they're exempt. If the public funds would be used only to provide electric delivery service for the local government's own use. The yes on 16, expenditures, Californians to protect our right to vote, and major funding from Pacific Gas and Electric Companies, a coalition of taxpayers, business, and labor, and most of the funding is coming from Pacific Gas and Electric, PG&E, almost overwhelmingly the amount. And so far they have spent $23 million. The no on Proposition 16, Stop the PG&E Power Grab, sponsored by Local Power and Utility Reform Network, has spent $33,341. Okay. 17 is an initiative statute or law. It allows auto insurance companies to base their prices in part on a driver's history of insurance coverage. It changes the current law to permit insurance companies to offer a discount to drivers who have continuously maintained their auto insurance coverage, even if they changed their insurance company, and notwithstanding the ban on using the absence of prior insurance for purposes of pricing. It will allow insurance companies to increase cost of insurance to drivers who do not have a history of continuous insurance coverage. It establishes that lapses in coverage due to non-payment of premiums may prevent a driver from qualifying for the discount. Fiscal impact would probably not be significant. This is because overall premiums are predominantly determined by other factors, such as driver safety, number of miles driven, and years of driving experience, which are unaffected by this measure. This measure amends the 1988 Proposition 103, which requires the insurance commissioner to review and approve rate changes for certain types of insurance, including automobile insurance, before changes to the rates can take effect. So this measure amends 103, Proposition 103, to allow an insurance company to offer a continuous coverage discount on automobile insurance policies to new customers who switch their coverage from another insurer. If an insurance company chooses to provide such a discount, it must be based on the length of time the customer continuously had bodily injury liability coverage. Customers would generally be eligible for this discount so long as their coverage had not lapsed for more than 90 days in the past 5 years. Yes on 17, Californians for Fair Auto Insurance Rates and Mercury General Corporation, who actually funded 99% of the yes on 17, have expended $718,000 so far. And Stop Proposition 17, sponsored by a campaign for consumer rights and other consumer groups, have expended $83,843 to stop this proposition. Thank you.
Thank you, Eileen, for sharing the pros and cons of these propositions. There are 2 websites you can check for more information about the June 8th primary election. They are smartvoter.org and LWVsacramento.org. This presentation on ballot propositions and candidate forums will be rebroadcast on Metro Cable Channel 14. Visit www.sacramentocable.tv for the schedule. Thank you for joining us for this candidates forum. The League of Women Voters encourages you to learn as much as you can about the five ballot measures facing California voters and about the candidates who will appear on your June 8th ballot. The League is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization, and we welcome donations to continue our work. Please see our website for donation opportunities at www.lwvsacramento.org. The League of Women Voters is where hands-on work to safeguard democracy leads to civic improvement. Please remember to vote June 8th. Thank you and good afternoon.